and welcome. My name is Paolo, and today I would like to tell you something about my doctoral dissertation project, which, as you can see, focuses on English as a lingua franca and specifically on the attitudes of teachers towards the relevance and feasibility of English as a lingua franca materials for their future contexts. The bottom line of the study is that English has changed. The way we use English around the world has also changed, but are teachers ready to adapt to these changes? So today I'm not going to lecture you on what English as a lingua franca is. Instead, I'm going to mention why we might consider teaching English as a lingua franca in certain contexts, and I will also focus on the project itself, which is about how we might be able to teach English as a lingua franca through materials in practice. But first things first, why would we consider teaching English as a lingua franca? Well, there are many reasons, but I'm going to focus on only one, and I'm going to use this picture, which I've taken from David Crystal, to help me explain. This picture shows us the number of English users in the world back in 2003. Today, the data is more or less the same, except the expanding circle is even bigger. What this picture tells us is that the majority of users of English in the world are not the so-called native speakers, but rather people who have learned to use the language because of the pragmatic benefits that it can bring. They don't use it in their everyday lives, but they've learned it in school. And if what this picture is telling us is the truth, then why are we still focusing exclusively on the teaching of idealized native varieties? Because standard Englishes by themselves are not going to adequately prepare students to English users on a global stage. And we as teachers are really doing them a disservice if we are not, if we're only teaching them received pronunciation or general American. Because if my students wanted to say, "Oh, Paolo, I would like to study at the University of Aberdeen, can I do that only with received pronunciation?" I don't think so, because in Aberdeen, not only because of the Aberdonian dialect, which is quite different from received pronunciation, but both in the university and the city of Aberdeen, you find people who speak English, but they originally come from all over the world, and they have their own unique way of using English. So without English as lingua franca, we are not really preparing these learners to what they are bound to find on the global stage. But this is the ideological dimension. Another reason why we might want to teach English as a lingua franca is whether there is any relative advantage for the learners. And by relative advantage, I mean whether there is any practical benefits for the students themselves. And while this area of the research is still in its infancy, we actually do have some tentative evidence about the advantages of learning English as a lingua franca. For example, learners have been found to be more confident in using the language, and they also seem to perform better in terms of intelligibility compared to learners who have only been exposed to the traditional approach. All right, but when I was a student, I was first exposed to this paradigm. I thought, wow, this is great. This is really what my students need. However, I had one question which I wanted to be answered, and the question was, um, how can I do this? How can I teach English as a lingua franca? But here's the problem, we are not quite sure of how to do this yet, because there are still several barriers which we have not learned to overcome, among which is the main focus of my research, which is the lack of appropriate materials for teaching English as a lingua franca. There have been studies which have looked at what actually is taught in currently commercially available materials. And what we found was that there is an exclusive emphasis on idealized native varieties. You'd be lucky to find a Scotsman in a single activity in the whole book. Um, but if this is the case, if this is what research tells us, then the next question is, what can we do about this? Well, currently, the main tendency in the research is to claim that we as researchers, there isn't that much that we can do about this because the responsibility, until these materials become more widely available, the responsibility for creating them or adapting traditional textbooks will fall on the shoulders of the teachers themselves. This, however, leads me to ask a question. Are these practitioners ready to do this? Can they actually adapt traditional materials into English as a lingua franca oriented material? Um, well, we already have some ideas of what these materials could be, but the problem is, as you can see from this slide, is that all we know about English as lingua franca materials comes from the top, meaning from researchers. And although these suggestions are quite sensible, they might be difficult for practitioners to understand. For example, a teacher might be confused about the meaning of depicting culture as dynamic. How to do that? What kind of activities can be used to depict culture in a dynamic, non-nation bound way? And here's where we are lacking because, as far as I understand, there is very little research that engages with practitioners from the bottom up, meaning investigating, listening to what these teachers are concerned about, and acting upon those concerns. What is needed, in my opinion, are much thicker descriptions of examples of English as a lingua franca materials made by practitioners themselves. We also need greater engagement to understand what their attitudes towards these materials are, because their ideas of English as a lingua franca oriented materials might be quite different from the ideas of the scholarly literature. We also need to understand the development process much better. There really isn't much that we know currently about the difficulties and the ways to overcome these difficulties in developing English lingua franca materials. And finally, we will also need to observe how these materials are used in actual classrooms. And thus we also need classroom trialing, research focusing on this trialing. All of these elements, except for the final one, are contemplated in my project, and I will explain at the end of the presentation why I'm not focusing on trialing. But here's where I talk about my project in greater detail, starting from the people whom I've envisioned as the participants in my research. These are the people with whom I'm going to collaborate. I've selected them because I reckon that they would be not only the people best equipped to attempt an adaptation of English as a lingua franca oriented materials, but also the people most interested in actually contributing to this research area. I'm not going to focus right away on the methodology itself. I'm going to detail it in greater depth in the next few slides. But what I want to do right now is make sure it is well understood what is it that I'm trying to accomplish with this project. Uh, First of all, I want to understand, I want to explore whether the suggestions from the top, from the scholarly literature, are actually compatible with the beliefs, the feelings, and the practices of teachers, or whether there is a gap between the attitudes of one group and the attitudes of the other, and exactly figure out what what is it that the participants understand as English as a lingua franca oriented materials. Next, I want to look at the materials themselves. So I want to describe exemplary materials made by these teachers exactly and provide examples of what they believe these materials might look like. And finally, as I mentioned before, I want to have a closer look at the development process itself. Specifically, I want to understand what kind of difficulties arise during the adaptation process and what kind of strategies are used by my participants in order to overcome them. I also want to understand what kind of resources they use in order to get inspiration for the development of these materials. So in the next slides, I'm going to reiterate these aims and going in depth about how I'm going to try and accomplish them, starting with the first one, with the compatibility issue. So this is something that has been explored before in research, but I've always found previous studies to have used questions that were quite abstract, if not downright abstruse. And so, in order to overcome this limitation, this is what I have thought. I have thought of giving these to my participants. These are pages from a sample ELF oriented unit, which I've developed myself on the basis of the suggestions of the scholarly literature. So, with a practical example, I want to understand whether this would help me get a better insight of what the participants understand about English as a lingua franca oriented materials. Basically, I would give them these examples and I would ask them, do you like it? Do you think this is appropriate for your future teaching context? Do you think it could be any better? So this is the first part. Then for the next part, which as I mentioned before, is about trying to provide a practical example of what bottom-up ELF materials might look like, I have thought of going at it in this way. Basically, I thought the best way to investigate this would be to provide my participants with an example from a traditional textbook unit and then ask them to perform an adaptation task. So basically, they would take this unit and I would ask them, make any changes that you deem necessary in order to transform this into something more suitable for teaching English as a lingua franca in your future teaching contexts. And I have no idea what is going to come out of it. That's what I want to find out. What materials for teaching ELF are from the perspective of my own participants. And finally, in tandem with this aim, I'm going to try to get a better understanding of the development process itself. And the best way to do this, I found, would be to ask my participants to self-record while performing the adaptation task that I mentioned earlier. And these recordings would not be used as observations because I do not want to risk imposing my own understanding on these artifacts. Instead, I am planning of using these videos as prompts for recall protocol sessions in which basically I would sit down with my participants, we would watch the videos together, and I would have them explain to me what exactly was going on, what kind of challenges were emerging, how they were feeling, what they were doing in order to address these difficulties, why did they use certain resources instead of others, etc., etc. And yeah, this leads us towards the end. There's only one more thing that I need to clarify before I say goodbye, and that's we need to acknowledge that there are still a few limitations in the study. Limitations which are quite common in English as a lingua franca research. One of which is the fact that I'm conducting my research in universities, so in an educational setting which most of ELF research has already taken place, and most importantly, the fact that the design of my study is cross-sectional, meaning I am not collecting my data over a certain period of time. I'm not checking whether these attitudes are actually changing after certain key points in the teacher's development. And there really isn't much that I can do to address these limitations within my doctoral project. However, I am considering conducting some follow-up studies with my participants in order to address these limitations afterwards, after the end of my project. And hopefully, the overall aim of my entire research path, both my doctoral project and these follow-up studies, would allow me to gain a greater insight of certain dimensions which I mentioned earlier. All this work might allow me to generate an analytical framework which would allow me to better explore the dimensions of trialability and relative advantage in in relation to English as a lingua franca oriented materials, how these dimensions could be explored better in future studies. Well, that pretty much concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. All I can say is thank you. And in case you happen to know about a context which might be interested in participating in this kind of research, then I would be extremely happy if you could contact me about it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you again.